Welcome, everyone, to our AIA CES approved course 911, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, January 18th, 2018. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth. This is part 3, the Twin Towers in Extreme Heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 2,900 architects and engineers dedicated to educating building professionals and the public about the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Before we go further, let me introduce you to Andy Steele, our operations manager. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Richard. Hello, everybody. I just want to let everyone know that we will be taking questions on the material that Richard presents in today's webinar. You can submit them in the questions and answer box at ae911truth.org. Architects and engineers can receive one learning unit for taking our course today. For those of you who are AIA members, as an approved course provider, we will be reporting your attendance directly to the AIA. So at this time and also at the end of our program today, we will need you to log your attendance by submitting your name, AIA number, and other information, including any questions you might have, in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. If you're not an AIA member, we can email you a certificate of course completion, which you can forward to your other association for credit. You just got to ask us for it. Or if you're catching us later on the YouTube archive, you'll need to pass a simple short quiz to earn your learning unit. Please feel free to follow along with that quiz as we give the presentation here. You can find the quiz on our website at ae911truth.org/continuing-ed, or just look for the Continuing Ed banner on our homepage at ae911truth.org. And please see our several other AIA-approved course formats, including the opportunity to bring our live presentation to your firm or AIA chapter for the additional benefit of your colleagues. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible here at a local firm in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time with this investigation, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects and engineers and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. Speaking of which, as Andy mentioned, you will receive credit for this course, or you can. And if you do the procedures Andy mentioned, we will report for the AIA members your credit directly online. The AIA does not, of course, endorse any of the content of any of their CES continuing education providers. And we'll take your questions at the end, as we discussed, as Andy mentioned. As documented extensively by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, the molten metal was seen pouring out of the South Tower during the 7 minutes leading up to its collapse. Molten metal was also observed in the debris of both buildings. And while various other evidence of extreme heat and incendiary chemical reactions have been documented since. In 2005, NIST concluded that the Twin Towers destruction resulted from the combined effects of the airplane impact damage and the ensuing fires, both of which phenomena fail to account for the extreme heat observed before and after the Twin Towers destruction. Does NIST's explanation for these unprecedented structural failures explain the evidence? Well, after today's course, you'll be able to describe for yourself the characteristics of building fires and the aspects of design that have contributed to make fire-induced failure in steel frame high-rises a rare occurrence. You'll be able to recognize the distinct features associated with fire-induced failure versus those associated with the procedure known as controlled demolition. You'll be able to describe step by step the series of structural failures that NIST claimed to be the cause of the collapse of the Twin Towers, and analyze the physical evidence and dynamics of the collapses according to how consistent they are with these two competing hypotheses. So we use the scientific method in the West, as we looked at in part one in this series in very detailed fashion. We have a question: how do the towers collapse? We do some background research, make some observations, construct a hypothesis. How have other towers collapsed? Jet planes brought them down, maybe fire, maybe explosions, controlled demolitions. All the rational hypotheses are laid out in an objective fashion. We don't allow our political or financial bias to focus in on one or the other. This is an effort to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. So we test those like competing hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. And if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis that stands a better chance against the experiments, data, and so forth. So with this in mind, we'll look at some background research. What are the forces that have destroyed buildings before? High-rises haven't been destroyed by fires, but what are the causes of the destruction of fire? It's an organic process, moves through the building every 20 minutes or so in a given area. That's all the fuel there is. And the fire moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So fires cause buildings to fall chaotically in stages over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the cold, hard, intact structure below. In fact, there's been some incredible tests done, like this 8-story building that was built and they, with steel frame, and they put 2,000-degree fires in it. Let's see what happened. Until recently, of course, we're referring here to 9/11, when we had not one, not two, but three protected steel structures collapse due to fire. So it bears looking at very, very much so. In fact, the report here indicated that the structural steel system is inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of this form. And these are protected and non-protected steel structures in this fire, and they still didn't fail. The steel in the World Trade Center towers was protected. This steel in this building that was highly damaged due to fire was not protected, and we can see what happened to it. It merely sagged. There are some steel buildings that have not protected steel have collapsed due to fire, but many that don't. Well, these buildings fell due to natural causes. They fall over to the path of least resistance because that's where the damage is. But the concrete does not pulverize to a fine powder. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. So let's keep this in mind as well as what we might expect something to a building that has collapsed due to natural causes to look like. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic like clouds of pulverized building materials that are expanding rapidly due to the incredible heat produced by the chemical reactions from the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Let's put that on the shelf now, too, as we proceed and find out how explosions can be harnessed very efficiently in buildings to bring them down, as we see in this series of explosive controlled demolitions. There's only a handful of companies that are even qualified to engineer and place these explosives and bring these buildings down in the manner that you see by placing thousands of synchronized shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and setting them off in a very defined order. It's an art and science that fire does not do. There's a series of typical features of controlled demolition, beginning with number one, a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. A straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint because there's a patterned removal of column supports, resulting in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. And number five, the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. Number six, limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Number seven, a patterned series of explosions and heard by witnesses and flashes of light seen by them. Number eight, a broken up concrete, so it can be loaded up onto trucks and so forth. Nine, explosive charges that are visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs or isolated explosive ejections. Number 10, chemical evidence left behind of explosive devices. If we have these features, we know we have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. And fire does not create these features. Why? Well, fire creates collapses that are asymmetrical deformations, following the path of least resistance. And never in high rises, as you see here in Los Angeles, First Interstate building, for instance, 3.5 hours it burned over 5 floors. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. No collapse. Why do modern steel reinforced high rises not have collapses? Well, steel conducts that heat away from the source. But so we have a 100,000 ton heat sink in the case of the Twin Towers. To keep that steel from ever getting to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature at which steel can lose half its strength and begin to sag. But we keep that from happening anyway with cementitious fireproofing on all the core columns and beams, for instance, particularly in the steel, particularly in the core of Twin Towers, and also
I'm just going to jump in for a moment. Sorry to interrupt, Richard, but we are not hearing you. So Richard's going to make some adjustments, and hopefully.
there was a mute on. Well, how long has that been going on?
Just a few moments.
Oh gosh, thanks. Well, I'm going to proceed. Uh, my elbow hit the mute button. Sorry about that, everybody, and Andy. Um, and so we we have several reasons why high rises have not come down due to fires, and we have cementitious fireproofing. We have the steel conducting the heat away, even without that. In buildings that are not fireproofed, as you saw in that test, and we build our buildings out of non-flammable contents, and we regulate what the tenants can bring in and what they can't. We also sprinkler these buildings so the fires never get to be a problem. Of course, the sprinklers were damaged, sprinkling system in the case of the Twin Towers, uh, damaged by the plane impacts. Well, with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence like government documentation, you don't just bring down a building in a day. You have to plan it so people know about it. There's foreknowledge, and they have to be approved by government authorities, of course. Experts agreeing, at least those experts that don't have political or financial imperatives that would keep them from having an objective opinion. Video documentation, all this is proof of controlled demolition. With that in mind, um, let's proceed and take a look at the Twin Towers, noting that last week in part two of this series, we looked at the explosive nature of the Twin Towers destruction with the sudden onset of destruction, the location of the jet plane impacts, patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. Number three, straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint in the case of the very explosive demolition of the Twin Towers. Number four, we looked at the ejections of 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections, uh, 80 miles an hour laterally out of the towers, landing 600 feet away, many of them. We looked at the speed of this uh, collapse, 2/3 of free fall acceleration, straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. We looked at the total shattering of the structural steel frame from top to bottom in a dozen seconds, and the lateral ejection uh, of of these members. And number eight, pulverized pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. Those features we looked at are all just direct evidence of destruction with explosives. And fire doesn't create those features, any of them, let alone all of them. So what we're going to do in part three today with this series is look at features 8, 9, and 10, beginning with pulverized or pyroclastic-like clouds. And in fact, the National Fire Protection Association Guide for Investigation of Fire and Explosions, Guide 921, says, look for thermal effects in your effects of explosions. Well, that's what we're going to do today. Large volumes of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. These are occurring, in fact, before, during, and directly after the final destruction, as we see in these rapidly expanding plumes in these photographs. Cauliflower shapes, expanding. In fact, 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. This is extraordinary. That takes a lot of heat, a whole lot more heat than was available in the towers at the time of their collapse. And enough heat, perhaps, to created by something like this, but not the few small scattered fires that we see in the Twin Towers at the time of the collapse. Oxygen starved, indicated by the thick black smoke and flames, especially at the South Tower, going out at the time of the collapse. So let's look, though, and see where that heat might have come from as we look at feature number 8, persistent extreme heat. Molten steel and iron? What are we talking about here?
Explain phenomenon Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out of the fire? There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
We would create an air pocket by moving the steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You'd be in the middle of it. It would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and iron workers with their boots literally melting, and then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how the debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
This is rather extraordinary because fires don't last that long and they're not that hot. We'll come back to this point. David Scott of Arup Associates, formerly of Arup Associates, red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. This firefighter says it was dripping from the molten steel. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, said Peter Tully, president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams. Molten metal, which is still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. A metal dripping from a beam, molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition Inc., who had a cleanup contract here. Molten steel was encountered primarily during the excavation of the debris. There are both videotapes and still photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A little river of steel flowing, says who? The structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself, Leslie Robertson, an eyewitness to this phenomenon. His associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. You can see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. There's molten steel or iron pouring out of the tower. NIST says in a frequently asked question answer to such, they say, well, this must have been melted airplane. Well, molten aluminum looks silvery in daylight conditions like this. It doesn't glow bright yellow, like you also see pouring out of the material held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator. And in the police museum, what do we see? A handgun with molten concrete wrapped around it. Fire temperatures were so intense, melted like lava around everything in its path. Concrete takes about 3,200 degrees to melt. I didn't even know concrete could melt. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. This is the fire protection engineer, Jonathan Barnett, author of the FEMA report. And documented by Abelhausen Astani Azel, structural engineer who had a National Science Foundation grant to examine some of the few pieces of steel that managed to be saved. I saw melting of girders. You remember the Salvador Dali paintings, he says, with the clocks that are kind of melted. It could only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. What else? Documented here in Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at Ground Zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Well, how do we get temperatures that hot? FEMA put in their 2002 report a metallurgical examination. In the Appendix C, what do they document here? A 1-inch column reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scrawl, thinned to almost razor sharpness. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Liquid iron, that's molten iron. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Where does the sulfur come from? Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times. But not even a mention in the final NIST report of this incredible phenomena. All this sulfur? Well, they were asked, and so they answer, sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in the interior partitions. Wait a minute. Gypsum wallboard has inert calcium sulfate, but in its 100-year history of protecting steel frame structures, it's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. Quite a stretch on NIST's part. Well, you can do experiments to determine this in your own backyard, like Jonathan Cole did. 2,000-degree fires, lots and lots of gypsum board against the steel. Was there any attack on the steel? No. It looked pretty good. Oh, it burned. That smell of sulfur can never block it out. It haunts me, says this iron worker. What does NIST have to say about this phenomena, these extreme temperatures? Let's listen to John Gross, co-project leader of the NIST report.
A pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody used it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
Get down below and see.
Like you're in a foundry.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. The steel was coming out red in certain areas for the first couple of weeks. This fused element of steel, molten steel. And they pulled off a big block of concrete. And there was a little river of steel flowing.
Well, here is John Gross on top of the pile before the FEMA investigation, cutting off the end of the partially evaporated beam that was provided to FEMA for their detailed metallurgical examination and included in their Appendix C, but which, when he, as the head of the NIST report, took over the investigation, ejected that metallurgical examination and denies evidence of molten or steel or evaporated steel. This is extraordinary, needs an investigation all by itself. Well, how do we get these temperatures? You know, hydrocarbons, which includes buildings and jet fuel, by the way, they only burn 600 to 1,400 degrees. In fact, the ME Petroleum, the manufacturer of jet fuel, suggests that their jet fuel burns only 600 degrees in open air. So that's much less temperature than normal office fires. Well, it's about the same as normal office fires, but it's not a hot office fire, those temperatures. Thomas Iger suggests 1,200 degrees, but in fact, steel had begun to melt, so it can't happen at 1,200 degrees. As you see here, the color of this molten material gives us its temperature. It's well over 2,500 degrees, or at least 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. How do we get those temperatures? What caused all this steel to melt? We'll be looking at thermite as a suspect. In fact, NIST says any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from the long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Well, does that make any sense? According to the law of the conservation of energy in a closed system, such as fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. For instance, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. You can only convert that energy you have from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated. It's not increased. Well, is there any evidence of thermite incendiaries in the World Trade Center? What could have produced all that molten metal? What is thermite anyway?
Incendiary used by the military Thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here. If thermite was used, we'd have an explanation for the extreme temperatures, because it creates 4,000 degree temperatures of what? Molten iron. So it would explain the molten iron that we are going to see more evidence of too. It would explain also the sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, making it much more effective at cutting through structural steel. Well, was the guide used in FPA 921? It says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite. NIST says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, later, a year later, when they were pressed, they finally admit they didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you aren't testing for, but others found it, looked for it, and it wasn't hard to find. Stephen Jones is one of those, a former nuclear physicist a nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. He says, well, if you're going to have thermite, you'd have a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, and in the pools of molten iron pouring out of the buckets of the excavators that we've already seen. You'd also see a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide. It's an ash. Well, that's what we see rising up above the material pouring out of the South Tower. This white ash, aluminum oxide, and trailing these 4-ton structural steel sections back to 3, forward 2, 3, back to forward 2. The steel sections are not flammable, so they're not like on fire, but obviously something happened to the ends of these beams of steel, 4-ton, 8-ton sections ejected laterally out of the towers. Well, he says thermite would leave behind unique chemical evidence, common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon. Unusual elements also, though, such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table of the elements. Well, somebody sent Stephen Jones a chunk, a piece from this 40-pound chunk of material, previously molten material. And hearing about some of the work he was doing, he does electron microprobe data, finding it's predominantly iron. So it's not molten aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so it's not structural steel. And it has aluminum, sulfur, potassium. These are the byproducts of thermite. But more interestingly, or even more interestingly, manganese and fluorine in abundance. What? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges. So these are often present in the residue and are part of a thermite fingerprint. It's more interesting. 1,3-diphenyl propane would be the result if sol gels were used, a very special form of thermite? Well, the EPA analysis found one molecule present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Speculated that it might be from computers, but we've had many computers burned in office fires, and yet no 1,3-diphenylpropane has ever been found. Well, this Peace Park sculpture in Canada had a piece of slag hanging off of it. The artist sent this to Stephen Jones. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis. What does it show? Iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. Wow. These elements are part of the thermite fingerprint. But what is thermite, the residue of thermite, doing on the ends of these beams? Now, this is a clean cut. The iron workers use oxyacetylene torches. It's very effective at cutting through steel, as you see here, in a controlled fashion. Much less controlled is this cut or destruction. What's producing this jagged cut, leaving residue of aluminum behind on the steel? Certainly not the oxyacetylene torch, and this piece as well. Aluminum indicating the incomplete combustion of or chemical reaction of thermic materials. And these core columns that have a thick slag pouring off of them, off of these 45-degree cuts that are, it is here before the iron workers ever even got to the site during rescue operations here. What's causing all of these cuts on all of these core columns? Office fires don't do this to steel. They don't do this either. This is a backyard experiment that's using a shaped cutter charge with thermite, in fact, thermate. John Cole made this material, set up his own backyard thermate cutter charge experiment.
The web was reduced in thickness, 18 holes, 10 components.
Like you see, in fact, here in FEMA's documented Appendix C of the World Trade Center report. In fact, you can have much more effective devices that were patented prior to 9/11, 2001, which issue streams of molten iron in just milliseconds, cutting through much thicker sections of structural steel shapes. And patented also is the devices, similar devices, whose casing is made of consolidated thermite. So it burns up too. All that's left behind is what? Pools of molten iron. All this is before 2001. Well, what else was found in this powder that was so ubiquitous in 9/11? The U.S. Geological Survey, in their detailed particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust, finds what? Billions of spheres, previously molten iron microspheres, diameter of a human hair on average, billions of them everywhere in the dust. They don't know where they came from. They're spherical. They're iron, not steel. We haven't used iron in our high rises for a long time. And this is a steel alloy combination. Estimates amount to about 10 tons by extrapolation of how much there was actually in the samples. 10 tons total. That's a lot of previously molten iron microspheres. They're formed during the event, says the International Engineering Group R.J. Lee, who also did toxicological studies on the dust, finding and documenting these spherical iron particles, and determining that up to 6% of some of these dust samples are previously molten iron microspheres. That's how you get the 10 tons material. The back, it's about 150 times more iron than the background iron that's can happen in normal office dust. And they're spheres, they're not iron particles. They're used as a signature component. There's so many of them, they're ubiquitous, in order to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these iron microspheres that we don't know how they got there, according to the official analysis. Well, let's find out how they got there. Here's a thermite experiment. Slowing it down halfway. Right here, thousands of what look like sparks, but they cool, they fall, and they are molten iron microspheres. Previously molten iron now. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars all around the World Trade Center? Is there another rational example or answer as to reason as to how these cars got toasted with obvious heat? Cooling, falling droplets. When a liquid is aerosolized, it becomes spherical by its surface tension into these extremely small drops. And in the case of molten iron, it's aerosolized by the explosive environment in the Twin Towers and cools and falls with all the dust, toasting people who are complaining about these incredibly hot clouds. What else was found in World Trade Center dust, though? Because 7 samples were independently collected and provided to a team of scientists led by Niels Harrit and Stephen Jones, including from Jeanette McKinley, who lived across the street from the South Tower on Liberty Street, and her whole window blew in when the towers went down, filling her apartment full of this dust. She saved some of it. She was an artist. She paid for that decision, unfortunately, with her life, having succumbed to brain cancer. But 4 of these samples were analyzed and documented, and they find these chips. They look like paint chips, but they come up to a magnet. They have iron, so they get real curious. They're about a 1/16 of an inch long on average. They zoom into the red side of this, and they find what? Ingredients of aluminum and iron, silica, oxygen, carbon. Wow, what is the ingredients of thermite doing in the World Trade Center dust in all of these red-gray dual-layered chips? It's also with this organic material. Well, they get real curious at this point. Look, zooming into the red layer 50,000 times, what do they find? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide, which is basically rust, and aluminum platelets, but at the nano scale, 1,000 times smaller than the human hair. They're in a proportion to become thermite, 3/4 to 1/4. They are set in a matrix of organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. This is how TNT works. All the organic content expands rapidly producing the concussive blast or the pressure wave. So that's very interesting. In fact, the existing comparative data from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory shows that this material had been developed, and when they put it in a differential scanning calorimeter, a heater, at about 420 degrees centigrade, which is about 750 Fahrenheit, it ignites, producing much hotter temperatures. It's energy. So it proves it's an energetic material. Well, that's what these 4 samples did exactly, proving it's not paint. It's a thermitic material in the World Trade Center dust. In fact, when it ignites, what does it produce? Previously molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust. So, as if we didn't know where these microspheres came from, they're actually found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips in the World Trade Center dust material. So you see, this is a self-corroborating, internally consistent set of repeatable data that can be brought to bear in a court of law as evidence in the crime of the century. This material was developed in Lawrence Livermore Lab and other defense contracting agencies. You see this, but when you reduce the size of this material, aluminum and iron oxide, down to extremely small particles of nano size, the surface volume increases exponentially. So you end up with chemical reactions that are virtually instantaneous. So what they've done is engineered an incendiary to become more explosive. It's very sophisticated, made only in the most advanced laboratories. So certainly there are clues to go on here as to where this came from. In fact, entities connected to NIST and super thermite research are Foreman Williams, Stephen Margolis, Arden Bement, and others associated with these defense contractors, SAIC. So certainly an opportunity for further investigation. According to Kevin Ryan, the top 10 connections between NIST and nanothermites in the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And they conclude, these scientists, that the red layer, the red-gray chips that they've discovered in the World Trade Center dust is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology and is a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. And that is now peer-reviewed in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal as of 2007 and stands uncontested. The way to contest somebody's theory or evidence or hypothesis is to produce a peer-reviewed paper of your own contesting it. This has not been done. So today in part 3, we've shown features 8, 9, and 10 of these 10 features, showing direct evidence of explosive destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them. Especially these fires, which were diminishing at the time of collapse, oxygen starved, indicated by the thick black smoke. In fact, thermal imaging videos show that these temperatures are 200 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit maximum. So if any of the World Trade Center buildings were to collapse due to fire, we'd expect it maybe to be this one, World Trade Center Building 5. Did it collapse? No. High-rise and mid-rise office structures do not collapse due to fires. Hasn't happened. What about other circumstantial corroborative evidence The testimony of the first responders we looked at in part 2. Data from the FEMA and NIST reports we'll take another look at here. In 2002, the FEMA report indicating with $600,000 of funding and a hampered effort by the investigators that couldn't get their hands on the plans, the steel, the site, the public who might have photographs to help them with. It was a real problem. In fact, Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, says fire engineering has good reason to believe that the official investigation blessed by FEMA is a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interests, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. Structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. So that was 2002. And in 2005, NIST takes over the FEMA report, throwing out, as we mentioned, the metallurgical examination that was included in Appendix C. And even though they had $20 million of funding in 3 years to produce their report, they were tasked by Congress with explaining to the American public how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. But did they? No. Found in footnote 13 on page 82 is their objective, which says the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You have 10,000 pages, 3 years, $20 million. You spend 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes, full of ubiquitous, irrelevant detail, 100 pages on fire modeling and safety issues, and only 1/2 page on the events following collapse initiation? In other words, the actual collapse? Where's the analysis that you were charged by Congress to provide to the American people? Well, here's what they say on that 1/2 page. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered a minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through the energy of deformation. Came down essentially in free fall. Well, this is all based on a theoretical and mathematical model provided by Besant, Zdeněk Besant from the Chicago Northwestern University, which we looked at in detail in part 2, finding all kinds of reasons to be suspicious because that mathematical model was rigged 12-1 in favor of a collapse. Do check out part 2 of this series so you can get up to speed on that if you haven't seen it yet. So this isn't analysis by NIST with supporting calculations. It's pure speculation on their part. It should have been titled The Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse. Well, NIST does, in fact, have reason to be reticent. We submitted a request for correction under the Data Quality Act, which you can do for national agencies like the National Institute of Standards and Technology. These reports that are faulty, they write back and say, we're unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Well, unwilling to provide any analysis whatsoever. What do the experts say? Well, here's some experts that are structural engineers. Ronald Brookman doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust, twisted steel? Fire protection engineer Ed Munyak The fires were very weak. NIST reports that they confirm that the steel temperatures were quite low, actually, because NIST found no temperatures exceeding 500-600 degrees, steel temperatures. World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. Destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Let's listen to Abolhassan Astani Azal, structural engineer.
Has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
But a little bit too late. This was easily the largest and most perplexing of structural failures in history. And yet, following 2 weeks after 9/11, this steel was sent away at 400 truckloads a day to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, once again, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. We do agree. And so which of the hypotheses that have been laid out for the destruction of the towers, jet planes, fire, are responsible for the destruction here? Controlled demolition? Each of us have to make up our mind and be clear on the evidence, because the implications are extraordinary for us, for our children. The 3 features we showed today are direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire doesn't create these features. When it causes less robust structures to collapse, they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. Last week we saw the first 7 features in part 2 of this series. So altogether, this is extraordinary evidence with additional corroborative and circumstantial evidence. This, we believe, is proof of controlled demolition. So we want to ask you your opinion as we wind up our for credit portion of this course. And in fact, at this time, before we get to your questions and give you some other interesting information, I want to reintroduce Andy Steele, who will let you know how you can get credit for this course today. Andy.
Okay, at this time, be sure to submit your name, AIA number if you have one, email, city, and state on the questions and information form. If you're not an AIA member, just ask us for a certificate of course completion, which you can then submit to your other association for credit. Also, you can submit your questions now in the same input form, and we will do our best to answer them. Or if you're watching the on-demand course on YouTube archive, you can now start your online quiz. Also, be sure to sign up for our monthly email newsletter on the right side of the website. In the meantime, we're going to take just a few minutes to answer some questions and tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree that the evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. And I do want people, you can take your quiz right here, as you can see on our website. And do sign up for our monthly email newsletter or news flashes so that we can keep you informed of the efforts we're making to achieve a new investigation. And you'll also be able to look on our website and find all kinds of new evidence, frequently asked questions, videos, and the opportunity to sign the petition yourself, calling upon Congress to call for a new investigation. Join the 2,900 other architects and engineers. If you're not an architect or engineer, join us by signing the petition. We have 20,000 of those who support the architects and engineers as well. You can sign that petition right here on our website. Donate also, become a member. We have 2,000 sustaining supporters which send us around the country going to the architects, engineers, the associations, including the American Institute of Architects, American Society of Civil Engineers. And we find that most of these architects and engineers are completely unaware of the third worst structural failure in modern history, World Trade Center 7. And so we begin by talking to them about that. And you can help us locally by volunteering and showing up at these conventions, and many other ways you can volunteer too, right, Andy?
Absolutely. If you're aware of this evidence and you want other people to know about it, we have a number of ways that we're reaching out, as Richard has talked about. So for just a few hours a week, you can help out, and that effort goes a long way. So if you want to volunteer, go to ae911truth.org, go up to the What You Can Do tab at the top, select volunteer, fill out a very short application, and we'll get in touch with you and get you to work.
Beautiful. And also, you can volunteer right here on our website, as Andy mentioned. But you can reach out on your own to elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know. Share this with architects and engineers in your area, your colleagues, and screen the DVDs. We'll show you one of them. Send the brochures that we have available on our website in our store. Share the World Trade Center evaluation, the finite element analysis study that one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country from the University of Alaska, he's the chairman of the civil engineering department there, Professor Leroy Hulsey, doing this $300 2-year analysis and determining already that fire, the official cause of Building 7's collapse, could not possibly have brought down the Twin Towers. Building 7. And he may be getting into modeling of the Twin Towers as the next part of his study, as a matter of fact. You can learn more about that at WTC7evaluation.org. We need your feedback from the draft report that's coming out in February, and would love to have you help us fund this project as well. We're maybe 3/4 of the way complete with the funding. An extraordinary effort by thousands of people coming together. So beyondmisinformation.org is a website dedicated to the 55-page booklet, or 50-page, that you can earn 2 HSW learning units just by reading and taking the quiz on the site. And our landmark documentary, in which we pulled together 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out even more evidence than you saw today. Peek.
Conspiracy theories. I think, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science. They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
That is controlled demolition. Segregated.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved. In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
This is a crime. I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And you can earn 1 HSW Learning Unit also just for watching this video, which is free on YouTube. So that's pretty good. And if you don't have, or those of you who are trying to share this information with others, if they don't have more than 15 minutes, I would show them Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center Building 7, narrated by Ed Asner, an extraordinary overview of the evidence for Building 7. Nobody walks away from this video not agreeing that we need a new investigation. And so the many courses that we have are included in our website, as you can see here. So I think we might have some questions. Andy, do we?
We do, and first, just a quick note. We apologize for the audio on some of the videos played today. We're having some technical issues, so thank you for your patience during that. Okay, our first question is a little long, so I'm going to recite it for you, Richard. It says, being that each floor of the Twin Towers had 2 different floor trusses, where half of the floor trusses were twice as long as the other half of the floor trusses, is it reasonable to expect the sides of the towers with the longer trusses and to collapse purely by gravity to fall at a much faster rate than the stronger, shorter floor truss sides? Wouldn't the longer trusses have more mass and less resistance to gravity than the shorter, stiffer trusses with less metal? In other words, how can the non-symmetrical design of the floor trusses lead to the symmetrical collapses that we see in all the videos?
I think that's a great question. We have the towers look symmetrical from the outside. They're squares, right? Each floor is the size of an acre. Inside, you have a rectangular shaped core, set of core columns, 47 massive core columns. So around that, you have lightweight steel trusses spanning 35 feet on one side, 60 feet on the other 2 sides. So 35 feet on 2 sides, and then on the opposite sides, 90 degrees from those, 60 feet spanning. So the kind of the heart of the question is, how does this asymmetry lead to symmetrical destruction? I don't think it's as much as a factor here as the questioner does. What NIST's theory is, as we discussed last week in part 2, is that the fires cause these trusses to sag, and they are talking about both the shorter trusses and the longer trusses. But what happens is that what they say is that when they sagged, they pulled in the perimeter columns. And whether that could happen on the shorter trusses versus the longer trusses is really quite open to debate. But there's not enough force developed in either case to pull in the perimeter columns. There's not additional lateral force generated by not enough by a catenary truss, which is basically a hanging, almost like a rope. You just don't get the forces developed that'll pull in 14-inch square steel tube columns marching every 3 feet 9 inches all the way around that building. They're just too strong. So what we discussed last week is that NIST forced those perimeter columns to fail in their model by applying a 5,000-pound load on every column laterally, forcing them to buckle, and then allowing their initiation of collapse in their computer model. So this is actually just not according to the best ethics. Trying to put this lightly. And then what's more interesting is you have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes we discovered last week. Asymmetrical damage from particularly the South Tower, which is 22 degrees and falling off the building in just the first few seconds, top portion. And asymmetry from the fires. So how can you have perfect symmetry that we see in the videos descending down each of the 4 facades of this building at almost free fall acceleration? It's accelerating faster and faster and faster, straight down through the path of greatest resistance. All those incredible array of exterior structural steel columns. It makes no sense whatsoever. Andy, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, I think you answered it. The last question that we got today is a lot simpler. It says, can tests still be performed on WTC dust even though so much time has passed?
Yeah, I think, second. There we go. I think we've gotten dust that has been saved and given to us over the years, and they continue to find red-gray chips of nanothermite in all of the samples that turn up, not just the first 4 or the 7 that were collected, the 4 that were documented, but there's been other scientists who have examined, like Mark Basil, who are examining the World Trade Center dust, and we keep getting calls from people who have dust, and it's just that the original scientists are, moved on, looking for or working on other projects. They're just not all assembled and available to analyze dust, as it turns up every year. It's really quite an undertaking, which takes a lot of funds to send these to the labs for various tests and so forth. But yeah, absolutely, it's available. What's more difficult to test for is high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, because the chemical residuals deteriorate, and they don't come out as positives after more than, I don't know what it is, a year or so. Anything else you want to add to that one, Andy?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. So that is it. That is the last question for today.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I'm encouraging everyone to consider what you've learned today in part 3 of this series, where we looked at high-rise fires, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite and nanothermite. All of this evidence it warrants a new investigation. So please join in. And if you missed last week, part 2, what we looked at was the explosive destruction of the Twin Towers, sudden near freefall collapse, high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering of the structural steel frame, the midair pulverization of concrete, and explosions or squibs, isolated explosive ejections going off 20, 40, 60 stories down below the zone of destruction, etc., etc. Join us as we start over again in February with part 1, World Trade Center Building 7, on the first Thursday in February, 2 p.m. Pacific time. We'll be there. I hope all of you will bring your friends as well. And until then, thanks so much for attending, and bye for now.